London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It was in the latter half of March, during one of those uneasy London springs when winter seems reluctant to release its grip, that Sherlock Holmes first displayed an interest in the affair which I now record under the title Sherlock Holmes Found the Truth and Regretted It. At the time, neither he nor I suspected that this inquiry, apparently modest in its scope, would weigh more heavily upon my friend's mind than many cases involving violence, notoriety, or international intrigue. I had returned to Baker Street earlier than usual that afternoon, having been dismissed from my medical duties by a sudden cancellation. Holmes was seated in his customary position upon the sofa, his long limbs drawn up, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes half closed in that peculiar attitude which indicated intense inward concentration rather than drowsiness. The room bore the familiar signs of recent intellectual exertion. Papers scattered upon the table, the sharp scent of tobacco in the air, and a half-disassembled violin resting upon a chair, its strings slackened. "You are early, Watson," Holmes remarked without opening his eyes. "Either your patient died more conveniently than expected, or the appointment was never genuine." "The latter," I replied, removing my coat. "You appear occupied. Another case?" "Not yet," he said. "Merely the anticipation of one, which, in my experience, is often more stimulating than its resolution." He rose and paced the room, stopping presently before the mantelpiece, where a small, unremarkable envelope lay propped against the clock. It bore no address beyond his name, nor any stamp of distinction, yet Holmes regarded it with an attention he usually reserved for far more dramatic communications. "This arrived by hand an hour ago," he continued. "No announcement, no request for an appointment, simply this." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was careful to the point of stiffness, as though the writer feared betraying himself through any flourish. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am in possession of information which, if mishandled, could ruin several lives, including my own. A man has disappeared. Officially, nothing is amiss. In truth, everything is. I beg you to see me tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Come alone." There was no signature. "A disappearance," I said. "That is hardly novel." "No," Holmes agreed. "But observe the phrasing. Officially, nothing is amiss. That suggests not mere neglect, but active suppression. And then there is the writer's fear, not of the disappearance itself, but of the truth surrounding it." "You intend to see him?" "I intend to understand him," Holmes replied. "Whether I see him depends upon what I discover before then." This was characteristic of my friend. Long before meeting a client, he would often reconstruct the outlines of a case through indirect inquiry, consulting newspaper archives, government gazettes, and his own astonishing memory for detail. That evening, he devoted himself to precisely such labors, leaving me to observe in silence as he sorted through documents related to recent civil service appointments, resignations, and unexplained absences. Shortly before midnight, he gave a soft exclamation of satisfaction. "Here we are," he said, tapping a column in the Times. "Mr. Edwin Carlyle, senior clerk in the Records Division of the Home Office, 47 years of age, unmarried, a reputation for punctuality so rigid that his colleagues jested he might expire should a clock be set wrong. 3 days ago, he failed to appear for work. An inquiry was made. It was concluded, remarkably swiftly, that Mr. Carlyle had taken sudden leave on account of nervous exhaustion. "And that was accepted?" I asked. "Too readily," Holmes replied. "No physician named, no prior indications, no family to confirm it. And most interesting of all, his rooms were sealed, not by his landlord, but by an official order." That last detail gave me pause. "On whose authority?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That is precisely the question." The following day passed in an uneasy quiet. Holmes declined an invitation to luncheon, contenting himself with coffee and a stale biscuit while he continued his inquiries. By evening, the fog had crept once more into Baker Street, blurring the gas lamps into indistinct halos. At 7:45, a cab drew up outside, and a man descended with visible hesitation. He was shown in by Mrs. Hudson, and at once I observed the signs of strain upon him. He was perhaps in his early 30s, well dressed, but carelessly so, as though the niceties of appearance had recently lost their importance. His eyes darted about the room before settling upon Holmes with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes," he said, lowering his voice unnecessarily, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "You have not yet told me your name," Holmes replied calmly. "For the present, I would rather not," the man said. "You may call me Mr. Harrow." Holmes inclined his head. "Very well. You wrote of a disappearance." "Yes," Harrow said, gripping his hat tightly. "But disappearance is not the proper word. Mr. Carlyle did not vanish. He was removed." "By whom?" I asked. Harrow hesitated. "By men acting under lawful authority," he said at last. "Or so they claimed." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright. "And you fear that the truth, if revealed, would cause harm?" Harrow met his gaze. "Yes, because the truth concerns not only what has happened now, but what was done many years ago and what was deliberately concealed. Mr. Carlyle knew, and because he knew, he could not be allowed to speak." There was a long silence in the room. Outside, a cab rattled past, its sound muffled by the fog. "I came to you," Harrow continued, "because I do not know whether the truth should be exposed at all. But I know this: if it remains buried, more will be taken, perhaps even myself." Holmes sat back slowly. I knew that look well, the expression he wore when a case ceased to be an intellectual exercise and became something far more serious. "You have placed a grave responsibility before me," he said quietly. "Before I accept it, I must know everything. And I warn you, once spoken, the truth has a habit of refusing to remain contained." Harrow swallowed hard. "That," he said, "is precisely what I fear." And so, in the flickering lamplight of Baker Street, the conflict was laid bare. Not merely the question of who had taken Edwin Carlyle, but whether uncovering the truth would serve justice or unleash consequences beyond any man's control. Holmes remained silent for several seconds after Mr. Harrow's last words, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flame of the lamp, as though the answer to the man's fears might be read there. At length he rose and rang the bell, requesting tea. The commonplace domesticity of the act seemed almost grotesquely out of place after the gravity of what we had just heard. Yet I knew Holmes well enough to recognize it as deliberate. He always insisted upon establishing control over the atmosphere before proceeding further. "You will forgive me if I continue to address you as Mr. Harrow," Holmes said at last, seating himself opposite our visitor. "Names, like truths, may be withheld for a time, but facts cannot. Let us begin with your connection to Edwin Carlyle." Harrow drew a deep breath. I was his subordinate. Not officially. Our departments were adjacent rather than hierarchical. But we worked closely. Mr. Carlyle had charge of certain archival materials, old records, sealed files, the sort that are rarely consulted and only with permission. "Permission from whom?" Holmes asked. "From a committee whose members change, but whose authority remains," Harrow replied carefully. "I do not know all their names. I doubt Mr. Carlyle did either. That, perhaps, was the first mistake." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "You imply a second." "Yes," Harrow said. "The second was curiosity." He explained that Carlyle, diligent to the point of obsession, had been assigned some months earlier to conduct a routine inventory of documents transferred from an older storage facility. Among them was a packet of papers, marked only with a date, 18 years past, and a single letter designation. No subject, no summary, merely a seal that had been broken and resealed. "He mentioned it to me in passing," Harrow continued. "Not the contents, only his unease. He said the file did not belong where it was, and that its presence contradicted other records he had handled." "And you encouraged him?" I asked. Harrow shook his head vigorously. "On the contrary, I urged caution. I reminded him that curiosity has undone men far more capable than ourselves. But Carlyle was not reckless. He was troubled. He said the papers suggested a man had been condemned for a crime he did not commit." Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, then back to Harrow. "Condemned how?" "Transported," Harrow said. "Sent abroad. The sentence was carried out swiftly. The documentation was immaculate, too immaculate, as though it had been prepared in anticipation of scrutiny." "And the crime?" Holmes pressed. "A bombing," Harrow replied. "An anarchist incident, one that caused a stir at the time, but was resolved with remarkable efficiency." Holmes nodded slowly. "I recall it. A device discovered before detonation. A suspect apprehended within hours. The newspapers praised the authorities for their vigilance." Harrow's voice dropped. "According to the file, the suspect was innocent. The device was real, but planted by another. The man convicted had been selected because he was convenient, foreign, isolated, and already under suspicion for unrelated activities." A heavy silence followed. The kettle began to whistle in the adjoining room. "Carlyle intended to report this?" I asked. "No," Harrow said. "At least not at first. He said the case was old, that reopening it would achieve little except to disgrace men long dead and destabilize public confidence. But then he found something else." Holmes leaned forward again. "What?" "A memorandum," Harrow said, "written years after the conviction. It stated that the true perpetrator had been identified, but that exposure was deemed inadvisable. The man in question had since become a valuable informant within certain radical circles. Allowing him to continue was judged to be of greater benefit than correcting the injustice." Holmes's expression hardened. "So, the innocent man remained condemned?" "Yes," Harrow said, "and Mr. Carlyle could not accept that." The tea arrived then, and for a moment the conversation paused while cups were poured. Holmes took his without sugar as was his habit when deeply engaged. "What steps did Carlyle take?" he asked. "He made copies," Harrow replied. "Not of the entire file, only of the most damning portions. He said he intended to consult someone, a barrister perhaps, or a journalist of discretion, but before he could act, he was summoned." "By whom?" "He did not know," Harrow said. "The note bore no name, only an address." Holmes glanced at me. "Let me guess, not the Home Office." "No," Harrow said. "A private house in Kensington." "And he went?" "Yes, that was 3 nights ago. The next morning he failed to appear at work. By noon his rooms were sealed. By evening we were told he had taken leave." "And you?" Holmes asked. "Why were you not also silenced?" Harrow smiled bleakly. "Because I was not certain. Carlyle trusted me, but he was cautious. He told me enough to trouble my conscience, but not enough to convict anyone. Still, I knew that if he were taken, I might be next." Holmes rose and began pacing once more. "You did well to come here," he said. "But understand this. The conflict you describe is not merely between truth and falsehood. It is between justice and expediency. Men in power will always claim the latter as virtue." "That is why I fear the truth," Harrow said. "Because once known, it cannot be unknown. And yet, if it remains buried, what does that make us?" Holmes stopped pacing and faced him squarely. "It makes you a man who has come to the right address. But do not mistake me, Mr. Harrow. If I uncover the truth, I will not promise to act as you expect. I act according to reason." Harrow nodded slowly. "That is all I ask." After he departed, the fog seemed to press closer against the windows, as though London itself were eavesdropping. "This is no ordinary case, Holmes," I said quietly. "No," he replied. "It is far worse. It is a case in which the crime has already been judged and found acceptable." He turned toward the desk, his mind clearly racing ahead. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall begin at Kensington. Whatever awaits us there, I suspect it will not wish to be found." The following morning broke with a pale, reluctant light filtering through the fog, which had settled into the streets during the night and now clung stubbornly to the city, as though determined to overhear whatever secrets Londoners might attempt to keep from one another. Holmes was already awake when I descended to the sitting room. He stood by the window, coat buttoned, hat in hand, his expression intent and unsmiling. "Kensington first," he said without preamble. "Then, depending upon what we find, or fail to find, we shall adjust our course." The address Mr. Harrow had provided proved to be a narrow street of respectable but aging townhouses, the sort that once sheltered prosperous families and now seemed inhabited more by memories than by comfort. The cab deposited us a short distance away at Holmes's insistence, and we approached on foot. Number 27 stood midway down the row, its brickwork darkened by soot, its windows carefully shuttered despite the hour. Holmes did not knock. Instead, he examined the doorstep, the lock, and the area immediately surrounding the door with that peculiar concentration which rendered the smallest details significant. He crouched briefly, running a gloved finger along the edge of the step. "Recent traffic," he murmured. "More than one visitor. Heavy boots. Military cut, if I am not mistaken. And yet the neighbors report nothing unusual, I suspect." "You have not asked them," I said. "Londoners are adept at seeing without noticing," Holmes replied. "Still, we shall inquire." The occupant of the adjoining house was an elderly woman whose suspicious gaze softened only marginally upon seeing Holmes's card. She admitted us into a narrow parlour smelling faintly of lavender and dust. When asked about number 27, she pursed her lips. "A quiet house," she said. "Too quiet, if you ask me. No children, no visitors that stay long. Gentlemen mostly, serious sorts. I thought it government work, perhaps." "Did you see Mr. Carlyle enter?" Holmes asked. She frowned. If that was his name. A thin man, neatly dressed. Yes, 3 nights ago. He came in the evening. He did not leave. That confirmed what we already suspected, yet hearing it spoken aloud lent it a weight that neither of us could ignore. We did not attempt to force entry. Holmes had already concluded that whatever the house might once have contained of evidentiary value had been removed. Instead, he circled the building, noting a narrow alley at the rear and a small, overlooked window on the ground floor. "Enough," he said at last. "We shall gain more by understanding who uses this house than by prying into its emptiness." Back in Baker Street, Holmes devoted the afternoon to identifying the property's owner. It emerged, after no small amount of inquiry, that the house was held under the name of a trust, one that appeared and vanished from records with disconcerting regularity. A convenience, Holmes observed, designed to exist only when needed. "And Mr. Carlyle?" I asked. "Where is he now?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "That depends upon whether his captors wished merely to silence him or to extract something first." That evening, Holmes paid an unexpected visit to Mr. Harrow. I accompanied him, though my presence was more for reassurance than utility. Harrow's lodgings were modest, his demeanour tense. "They know you came to Holmes," Holmes said bluntly. "Have you noticed anything amiss?" Harrow hesitated. "There was a man outside my building this morning, reading a newspaper. He remained for some time." Holmes nodded. "Then we must act quickly. Tell me, did Carlyle ever mention the name of the man falsely convicted?" Harrow shook his head. "Only initials, J.M. "Did he mention whether the man still lives?" "Yes," Harrow said. "Or at least, he did. According to the memorandum, the man was alive at the time it was written. That was 10 years ago." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then there is our next step." It took several days to trace J.M., a process complicated by false trails and outdated records. At last, Holmes identified a likely candidate, Jonathan Mercer, once a dock labourer, transported to Australia and later released under an assumed name. He had returned to England quietly some years earlier and now lived in obscurity on the outskirts of the city. We found Mercer in a small, poorly furnished house near the river. He was an older man than I had expected, his hair grey, his hands calloused, his manner wary. "You have no right to disturb me," he said, when Holmes explained our purpose. "No," Holmes agreed, "but I have a duty to inform you." Mercer listened in silence as Holmes outlined the truth Carlyle had uncovered. When it was done, the man sank heavily into a chair. "So they knew," he said hoarsely. "All these years, they knew." "They knew," Holmes confirmed. "And now?" Mercer asked. Holmes did not answer at once. "Now," he said slowly, "you are in danger." Mercer laughed bitterly. "I have been in danger my entire life." "Not like this," Holmes replied. "You represent a truth that has been carefully buried. Others have already paid for knowing it." Mercer looked up sharply. "Who?" "Edwin Carlyle," Holmes said. The name struck Mercer like a blow. Then they are still at it. Yes, Holmes said, and that is why I must ask you to trust me. Trust was not easily given by a man so long betrayed, but Mercer had little choice. As we departed, Holmes's expression was grim. The conflict is no longer theoretical, Watson, he said quietly. We are no longer asking whether the truth should be exposed. We are asking how many will suffer before the question is answered. And even then, I sensed that Holmes had already begun to fear the answer. Holmes insisted that Mercer should not remain in his house that night. The decision was made without debate, for the man himself seemed to recognize the wisdom of it almost as soon as it was proposed. Years of hardship had taught him when resistance was futile, and when caution might yet preserve him. By arrangement, Mercer was conveyed discreetly to a modest lodging near Paddington, kept by a former client of Holmes, whose loyalty was beyond question. The proprietor asked no unnecessary questions, content to accept Holmes's assurance that the matter concerned a private difficulty of a delicate nature. Only when Mercer was settled did Holmes permit himself a moment of reflection. We returned to Baker Street in silence, each of us absorbed in his own thoughts. For my part, I could not dismiss the image of Edwin Carlyle, methodical, conscientious, and evidently doomed by those very qualities. The injustice visited upon Mercer was grave enough. That it had been compounded by the quiet removal of a man whose only crime was diligence gave the affair a bitter edge. Holmes broke the silence as we reached the stairs. They will move soon, he said. Once they suspect Mercer is no longer isolated, they will either attempt to remove him as well, or force the issue another way. You believe they know we have spoken to him? I asked. They would be remiss if they did not, Holmes replied. You must understand, Watson, that we are not dealing with ordinary criminals. These men are accustomed to observing without being seen, to intervening without leaving marks. Their chief strength lies in their confidence that they act for a greater good. That night, Holmes slept little. I heard him pacing until the early hours, pausing occasionally to make notes or consult his files. By morning, he had formed a plan, though, as was often the case, he revealed it to me only in part. We require proof, he said over breakfast, not merely of Mercer's innocence, but of the deliberate choice made to conceal it. Carlyle's copies would have sufficed had they not been intercepted. We must reconstruct what he found. And the sealed archives, I asked. Holmes shook his head. Inaccessible now. Any request from me would alert them further. No, we must proceed indirectly. He began by revisiting the anarchist incident itself, poring over contemporary reports, witness statements, and court transcripts. What emerged was a pattern that now seemed obvious in retrospect. Testimonies that echoed one another too closely, a timeline that allowed no room for error, and a suspect whose supposed movements aligned with the authorities' needs, rather than with physical possibility. By midday, Holmes had identified a former inspector who had been involved in the arrest, now retired, living quietly in Surrey. We set out at once. Inspector Reeves proved to be a man worn down by years of service, and perhaps by memory as well. At first, he professed ignorance, insisting that the case had been clear-cut. Holmes listened patiently, then produced a single document, a minor discrepancy in the arrest report. Reeves's composure faltered. You were ordered to make the arrest before the device was fully examined, Holmes said calmly. You complied. Later, you were instructed to amend your statement. You did so. You were told it was necessary. Reeves sank into his chair. You don't understand, he muttered. We were told lives depended on it, that the man we arrested was dangerous, if not guilty in this instance. And when you learned otherwise? Holmes asked. Reeves looked up sharply. Who says I did? Holmes's gaze was steady. Your pension records include a special allowance, granted shortly after the trial, in recognition of services rendered. Reeves's shoulders sagged. I did what I was told, he said. I told myself it was for the best. That is what they all tell themselves, Holmes replied quietly. Reeves could offer little beyond confirmation of what Holmes already suspected, that the decision to sacrifice Mercer had been made swiftly, approved at a level beyond his reach, and insulated from scrutiny thereafter. As we returned to London, Holmes's mood darkened further. Every path leads upward, he said, and every step upward leads further from accountability. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Baker Street. Mr. Harrow was admitted in evident distress. They have questioned me, he said. Not officially. 2 men came to my office. They asked about Carlyle, about his habits, about me. Holmes nodded. Did you tell them of me? No, Harrow said quickly. But they knew, or suspected. Holmes gestured for him to sit. Then matters have reached their inevitable stage. They will attempt to close the circle. What does that mean for Carlyle? Harrow asked, his voice strained. Holmes hesitated, a rare thing for him. It means, he said slowly, that if Carlyle yet lives, his value to them diminishes by the hour. The implication hung heavily in the air. Harrow buried his face in his hands. This is my fault, he said. If I had not spoken to him. No, Holmes interrupted sharply. It is the fault of those who chose convenience over justice. Do not assume their guilt upon yourself. Yet, even as he spoke, I could see the toll the case was taking upon him. Holmes had always prided himself on detachment, on the ability to observe human frailty without succumbing to it. Here, however, the conflict struck too close to something fundamental, the belief that truth, once uncovered, must be acted upon. Late that night, Holmes received a message delivered by hand. No envelope, no name. It consisted of a single sentence. Discretion would be wise. Holmes read it twice, then placed it carefully upon the mantelpiece beside the first anonymous letter. They are warning me, he said. Or threatening you, I suggested. Holmes smiled faintly. In their minds, there is no difference. He turned to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. The irony, Watson, is that I am very close to the truth. And for perhaps the first time, I am uncertain whether proximity brings clarity or danger. I did not reply. There are moments when words are not merely inadequate, but intrusive. The conflict had deepened, the stakes sharpened, and the path forward narrowed. And though Holmes would never admit it aloud, I sensed that he already understood the cost of seeing this matter through. The warning left upon the mantelpiece did not produce in Holmes the agitation one might expect, but rather a curious stillness. He stood for some time with his hands clasped behind his back, staring not at the message itself, but at the wall beyond it, as though attempting to see through brick and plaster into the machinery that had set such words in motion. When at last he spoke, It was with a deliberation that suggested his thoughts had ranged far ahead. "They wish to remind me," he said, "that there are consequences to curiosity when it strays beyond its permitted boundaries." "And does that reminder trouble you?" I asked. Holmes turned slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a humorless smile. "It clarifies matters, which is far more dangerous." The following days were marked by an increase in subtle pressures. Holmes's inquiries were met with polite refusals, where once doors had opened readily. Old acquaintances in government offices suddenly found themselves unavailable. A request for a minor document was delayed without explanation. None of this was overt. Indeed, each instance might have been dismissed as coincidence had it not been for their cumulative effect. "They are attempting to slow us," Holmes observed, "to tire us, to convince us that further effort will yield nothing." "And will it?" I asked. "That depends," he replied, "on whether we allow ourselves to be convinced." It was during this period that Holmes received an unexpected invitation, summoning him, not as a detective, but as a consultant. The letter bore an official seal and requested his presence at a discreet office near Whitehall. No subject was specified. Holmes examined it carefully before handing it to me. They would not trouble themselves with formality unless they wished to appear reasonable, he said, which suggests they believe reason will suffice. "Will you go?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said. "To refuse would be to acknowledge their authority to intimidate. I prefer to hear what they have to say." He went alone. I remained at Baker Street, uneasy despite myself. Holmes returned some hours later, his expression composed, but his eyes dark with thought. "They were very courteous," he said, "almost apologetic. They spoke of national interests, of delicate balances, of the dangers inherent in disturbing settled matters." "And Carlyle?" I asked. Holmes's jaw tightened. "They did not mention him by name. That omission was deliberate." "What did they want from you?" "To disengage," Holmes replied. "They suggested that my talents would be better applied elsewhere. They assured me, most generously, that no harm was intended to any innocent party." "And Mercer?" Holmes did not answer at once. "They asked whether I believed the past could ever truly be corrected," he said finally. "Whether reopening old wounds might not create more suffering than it alleviates." "That sounds dangerously like persuasion," I said. Holmes gave a short laugh. "It was not persuasion. It was justification. They have long since convinced themselves." That evening, Holmes took the unusual step of burning several of his own notes. I watched in silence as the pages curled and blackened in the grate. "Precautions," he said, anticipating my question. "If matters turn against us, I will not have my work used to complete theirs." The next development came unexpectedly. Mr. Harrow arrived in a state of barely contained agitation. "They have arrested someone," he said. "Quietly, a clerk, a junior man, accused of leaking documents." Holmes's eyes flashed. "A scapegoat?" "Yes," Harrow said. "He has no connection to Carlyle's file, none at all, but he was known to ask questions. They are closing ranks." Holmes paced the room. "Classic containment," he murmured. "Divert attention, demonstrate authority, discourage dissent." "What can we do?" Harrow asked. "If they can simply choose someone and destroy him, then we must deprive them of the ability to choose," Holmes said. He explained his intention to assemble a complete, irrefutable narrative of the events. Mercer's innocence, the true perpetrator's identity, the decision to conceal, and Carlyle's removal. Not for publication, not yet, but as leverage. A threat, Harrow said uneasily. A deterrent, Holmes corrected. There is a difference. Over the next days, Holmes worked with relentless focus. He revisited witnesses long dismissed as irrelevant, uncovering contradictions and suppressed statements. He traced the career of the true bomber, discovering that the man had indeed served as an informant, one whose usefulness had waned, but whose exposure would still prove embarrassing. At last, Holmes possessed what he sought, not merely proof, but context. A truth so complete that to release it would be to shake the very structures that had concealed it. And yet, as he reviewed his work, I perceived a change in him. The exhilaration that usually accompanied such intellectual triumph was absent. Instead, there was a gravity, a reluctance. "You have what you need," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and that is precisely the problem." News then reached us of Edwin Carlyle. His body had been found in the Thames, the official verdict death by misadventure. No marks of violence, no inquiry deemed necessary. Harrow received the news in silence, his face ashen. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them with visible effort. "They have decided," he said. "Carlyle is to be a cautionary tale." The conflict had reached its cruelest point. Holmes had uncovered the truth, but the cost of its discovery had already been paid in human life. To proceed further would invite more such payments. To stop would render those already made meaningless. That night, Holmes sat long into the early hours, his papers spread before him, the lamp casting harsh shadows upon his face. When at last he spoke, it was not to me, but to the silence itself. "The question is no longer whether the truth should be known," he said softly. "It is whether justice can survive its revelation." I had no answer to give him, and for perhaps the first time since I had known him, neither, I sensed, did he. The days following the discovery of Edwin Carlyle's body passed with a peculiar slowness, as though time itself hesitated to advance while the consequences of his death settled into place. Officially, the matter was concluded almost before it had begun. A brief notice appeared in the papers, couched in the most anodyne language. A gentleman, despondent, fallen into the river, no suspicion of foul play. Holmes read it once and set the paper aside without comment. Privately, however, the effect upon him was unmistakable. He rose earlier than usual, slept little, and spoke less. When he did speak, it was with a precision that bordered on severity, as though he feared that any indulgence in speculation might betray him into a course from which there could be no retreat. "You are considering withdrawal," I said to him one morning, unable to restrain the observation. Holmes did not look up from his notes. "I am considering responsibility," he replied. "There is a distinction." "And what of Mercer?" I asked. "What of Harrow? What of the man wrongly convicted?" "They remain factors," Holmes said, "but they are no longer the only ones." He folded his papers carefully and placed them in a leather case, which he then locked and set aside. "The truth," he continued, "is not a weapon one may wield without consequence. I have often used it as such, trusting that its edge would fall only where deserved. This case challenges that assumption." Despite his evident reluctance, events conspired to force his hand. Mercer unsettled by Carlyle's death and fearful that he would be next, sent word through the Paddington innkeeper that he wished to leave London at once. "He is panicking," I said after reading the note. "With reason," Holmes replied. "If he disappears now, they will assume I have hidden him. That assumption may provoke action." "And if he stays?" Holmes's eyes met mine. "Then he becomes leverage against me." Holmes arranged to meet Mercer under the pretext of discussing travel arrangements. The meeting took place in a quiet public house near the station, its anonymity offering some measure of protection. Mercer was visibly agitated, his eyes darting toward every sound. "They killed him," he said, gripping the table. "The man who tried to help me. What chance do I have?" "Your chances depend," Holmes said calmly, "on restraint." Mercer stared at him incredulously. "Restraint? After all this?" "Yes," Holmes said, "because rash action will serve only their interests." Mercer's voice dropped. "Then what are you doing, Mr. Holmes? If you know the truth and yet refuse to act?" Holmes leaned forward. "Do not mistake caution for indifference. I am weighing outcomes." Mercer shook his head. "All my life, men have weighed outcomes, and I have paid the price." Holmes absorbed this without flinching. "If I release what I know," he said, "you may receive vindication, but you may also receive a bullet, or worse, you may receive nothing at all, while others suffer in your stead. And if you do nothing, then your injustice remains uncorrected," Holmes said, "but it remains singular." Mercer laughed bitterly. "You speak as though injustice were a natural disaster, something to be contained." Holmes did not answer. When the meeting ended, Mercer departed unconvinced, his trust in Holmes visibly shaken. That evening brought another visitor to Baker Street, one whose arrival Holmes had anticipated but not welcomed. The man gave his name as Mr. Fairfax, though Holmes later confided that this was almost certainly an alias. He was well dressed, confident, and possessed of that effortless authority which comes from long association with power. "I come as a friend," Fairfax said, seating himself without invitation, "and as a representative of those who would prefer matters to remain manageable." Holmes regarded him coolly. "You are late." Fairfax smiled. "We wished to be certain of your position." "And now you are?" Fairfax spread his hands. "We believe you understand the situation. We believe you recognize that further action would be counterproductive." "You believe," Holmes said, "that my understanding obliges my compliance." "I believe," Fairfax replied, "that you are a practical man." Holmes rose and crossed to the window. "Practicality," he said, "is often the refuge of moral cowardice." Fairfax's smile thinned. "Strong words." "Earned ones," Holmes replied. Fairfax stood as well. "Let me be plain. We know what you possess. We know what you could do. We also know what we could do in response. No one desires escalation." "Carlyle did not desire death," Holmes said quietly. A flicker of discomfort crossed Fairfax's face. "Unfortunate," he said, "but not intentional." Holmes turned back to him. "Then you admit involvement." Fairfax hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Enough." "I admit nothing," he said. "I merely urge discretion." "And if I refuse?" Fairfax's gaze hardened. "Then matters may proceed in ways neither of us prefers." After he had gone, Holmes remained standing, his posture rigid. "They are afraid," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Not of exposure, of precedent." What do you mean? If this truth is revealed, Holmes said, others may follow. Not this case alone, but the practice it represents. That is what they cannot allow. Holmes retrieved the leather case and opened it once more. He studied the contents as though seeing them anew. I have spent my life believing that truth, once found, must be acted upon, he said. This case suggests that such certainty may itself be a luxury. The conflict had reached a subtle but decisive phase. No longer was it a question of discovery. That work was done. The question now was one of choice. Whether Holmes would unleash the truth he held, knowing the harm it might cause, or contain it, knowing the injustice that would endure. And in that narrowing space between action and restraint, I saw for the first time the possibility that Holmes might choose neither path cleanly, but instead seek some third course, one that would satisfy no principle fully and leave him with a burden no deduction could resolve. Holmes's search for that elusive third course occupied him entirely over the next several days. He neither abandoned the case nor advanced it openly, but moved instead with a deliberate obliquity, as though circling some central truth that could not be approached directly without peril. To an observer less familiar with his methods, it might have appeared that he had stalled. In reality, his mind was working with an intensity I had rarely witnessed, sifting not merely facts, but consequences. You are attempting to resolve a conflict that admits no clean solution, I remarked one evening as he sorted his papers for the third time that day. On the contrary, Holmes replied, I am attempting to resolve it with the least unclean one. He began by re-examining a figure who had so far remained curiously untouched by events. The true bomber, the man whose guilt had been quietly acknowledged and quietly ignored. Holmes had already identified him as Samuel Trench, a minor agitator whose usefulness as an informant had long since waned. Trench was not powerful. Indeed, he was scarcely relevant anymore. That, Holmes explained, was precisely what made him interesting. Men like Trench, he said, are protected not because they are valuable, but because they are inconvenient. Exposing them reveals the machinery behind their protection. And you intend to expose him? I asked. Not publicly, Holmes replied. Public exposure would force the very reckoning I seek to avoid, but private exposure may suffice. Holmes traced Trench to a boarding house in Clerkenwell, where he lived under a false name, subsisting on irregular payments from sources he did not question too closely. Holmes paid him an unannounced visit, presenting himself not as a detective, but as a man bearing uncomfortable knowledge. Trench was a small, nervous fellow, his bravado long eroded by age and circumstance. When Holmes began to speak of the bombing, of details known only to those involved, Trench's composure collapsed with remarkable speed. They told me it was handled, Trench stammered. They told me no one suffered. Holmes's voice was cold. An innocent man was transported. Another was murdered to preserve your silence. Trench covered his face. I never asked for that. No, Holmes agreed. You merely benefited from it. Holmes did not threaten Trench. He did not bargain. He merely laid out with merciless clarity the full extent of Trench's moral liability and the precariousness of his protection. When Holmes departed, Trench was left with the certain knowledge that his safety depended entirely upon the continued goodwill of men who found him increasingly expendable. Fear, Holmes later observed, is a powerful corrective. Properly applied, it may prevent further harm without creating spectacle. That same evening, Holmes turned his attention to Mr. Fairfax. He arranged, through indirect channels, a second meeting, this time on ground of his own choosing. Fairfax arrived with the same polished assurance as before, but I detected a new wariness in his manner. "You have been busy," Fairfax said lightly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "So have you. Trench has ceased to receive his allowance." Fairfax's eyes narrowed. "That was inevitable." "Indeed," Holmes said, "as is his potential to become indiscreet." Fairfax studied Holmes intently. "You are playing a dangerous game." "I am offering you an alternative to a dangerous outcome," Holmes said. "You may ensure that Trench remains quiet permanently and accept the risks that accompany such finality. Or you may allow him to live under the knowledge that his usefulness has ended and that his silence is maintained by fear alone." "And in return?" Fairfax asked. "In return," Holmes said, "you will cease your interference. Mercer will be left alone. Harrow will not be molested, and Carlyle's death will mark the end, not the continuation of this affair." Fairfax was silent for some time. "You ask us to trust you." Holmes's gaze was steady. "I ask you to trust that escalation benefits no one." Fairfax rose. "You leave much unsaid." "I leave much deliberately," Holmes replied. After Fairfax departed, Holmes allowed himself a rare display of fatigue. He sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is not justice," he said quietly. "It is containment." "And is that enough?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. "It is all that remains available." The following day brought a development that threatened to unravel even this precarious balance. Mercer, acting independently, had contacted a journalist, a well-meaning but imprudent fellow, hinting at a scandal suppressed by the government. Holmes learned of it through one of his irregulars, who overheard the journalist boasting of an impending revelation. "That cannot be allowed," Holmes said sharply. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever." We went at once to Mercer. Holmes did not rebuke him. He reasoned with him, explaining with painstaking care the chain reaction such exposure would unleash. Mercer listened, anger and despair warring upon his features. "You ask me to be silent," Mercer said. "Again." "I ask you to be alive," Holmes replied. After a long silence, Mercer relented, agreeing to withdraw his approach, for the moment. Yet the encounter left Holmes visibly shaken. "You are asking men already wronged to accept further wrong," I said once Mercer had gone. "Yes," Holmes said, "and I shall carry that knowledge with me." The conflict, though muted, was far from resolved. Holmes had managed to stall the machinery of suppression without dismantling it. He had protected certain individuals at the cost of broader accountability. The truth remained intact, but imprisoned, known fully to one man who had always believed that knowledge implied obligation. Late that night, Holmes stood once more at the window, gazing out at the lamplit street. "I have always held," he said softly, "that my duty was to uncover the truth and let others concern themselves with its consequences. This case has shown me the arrogance of that belief." He turned back to the room, his expression somber. "The truth has been found, Watson. Now I must decide how much of it the world can survive." And in his voice, I heard not triumph, but regret already taking root. The days that followed Mercer's reluctant agreement to remain silent passed with a heavy weight, each one pressing upon Holmes as though it were a necessary burden. His resolve remained as sharp as ever, but I could see that the cost of the decisions he had made, of the compromises he had accepted, was beginning to take its toll on him. He moved through his investigations with an urgency that was not born of necessity, but of something deeper, something that spoke of an unwillingness to let the case slip from his grasp. Yet every step he took seemed to draw him further from the clarity he had once believed in so firmly. I had never seen him so preoccupied, so consumed with thought. He was no longer simply Sherlock Holmes, the detached genius, the intellectual scourge of the criminal world. He had become something else, a man who had uncovered the full extent of a sin and found himself unwilling to act, unable to act without causing further harm. The truth, once a weapon in his hands, had become a shackle, and he was bound by it, a prisoner of his own convictions. "You seem lost in thought, Holmes," I remarked one evening, as I observed him meticulously cleaning his magnifying glass. "I am not lost," he replied, his voice distant though not unkind. "I am simply considering the cost." "The cost of what?" "Everything," he said, without elaborating further. "I have always prided myself on the fact that my work is a pursuit of clarity, of truth. But in this case, Watson, clarity may well be the enemy." I did not press him for further explanation, knowing that Holmes often needed time to work through his thoughts in his own way. However, it became increasingly clear that he was wrestling not just with the immediate consequences of his findings, but with the deeper moral questions that had been raised by the case. For the first time, I began to wonder if he had reached the point where the line between right and wrong, justice and expediency, was no longer as simple as it had once seemed to him. The following morning, we received a visitor who had been entirely unexpected. A man named Charles Gray, a government official of some repute, arrived at Baker Street with an air of quiet urgency. His manner was professional, though there was a certain tension in his movements, a nervousness that betrayed the true nature of his visit. "Mr. Holmes," he said, as he removed his hat and took a seat without waiting for an invitation, "I have come to request your assistance in a matter of the utmost delicacy." Holmes, ever the gracious host, motioned for him to continue, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, focused. "Go on," Holmes said. "I represent a group of individuals who, for the sake of clarity, I shall call concerned parties," Gray began, his voice low. "We have become aware of your investigation into the Carlyle case. We know of your discoveries, Mr. Holmes, and we would like to make a proposition." "Proposition?" Holmes repeated, his tone non-committal. "And what, pray, would that proposition entail?" Gray hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We wish to avoid unnecessary scandal. We wish to avoid further complications. If you would refrain from publicizing your findings, we would be willing to ensure that the matter is handled quietly, discreetly. No harm will come to Mr. Mercer. No further inquiries will be made into the Carlyle affair. You will be left to pursue your other cases without interference." "And in return?" Holmes asked, his voice suddenly hard. Gray met his gaze without flinching. "In return, we will provide you with resources, access to information, assistance in future cases, any number of things that may prove useful to you." Holmes was silent for several moments, considering the offer. I could see the temptation in his eyes, the lure of an easy resolution, a way to extricate himself from the moral quagmire in which he had found himself. "And if I refuse?" Holmes asked at last, his voice steady but carrying an underlying tension. Gray's gaze never wavered. "Then you will find yourself embroiled in a far more complex situation than you can imagine. These matters, Mr. Holmes, extend far beyond you, far beyond your investigation. We are prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure that they remain contained." Holmes's eyes narrowed, the sharpness of his intellect returning as he processed the weight of the situation. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, perhaps contempt, perhaps calculation, in his gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "And what is it you truly want, Mr. Gray?" Holmes asked, his voice now low and measured. "You speak of avoiding scandal, of containing matters. But what, precisely, are you protecting?" Gray hesitated once more, as though weighing whether to disclose the truth in full. When he spoke again, his voice was tinged with a new level of gravity. "Some things, Mr. Holmes, are better left undisturbed. There are forces at work here, forces that go beyond simple criminal activity. The truth you seek to expose is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous to the stability of this country, to the people who hold power. It must remain hidden for the greater good." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed upon Gray with a steely intensity. "And you believe the greater good is served by lies, by suppressing the truth?" Gray's lips tightened. "The greater good is served by maintaining order, by ensuring that the past does not come back to destroy the present. Some things must remain buried, Mr. Holmes. Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Gray. Finally, he spoke, his voice as cold as I had ever heard it. "I am not in the business of preserving lies, Mr. Gray," Holmes said. "I seek the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. And if your greater good requires the suppression of that truth, then I must decline your offer." Gray's expression darkened, but he did not immediately respond. He rose from his chair and placed his hat back upon his head, his movements deliberate, controlled. "Very well," Gray said at last. "You have made your choice. But understand this, Mr. Holmes. The path you have chosen is fraught with consequences. Be prepared to face them." With that, he left the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality. Holmes did not immediately move, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he stood by the window, his mind clearly elsewhere, far beyond the simple encounter with Gray. "It is done," he said finally, his voice distant. "Yes," I replied, though I felt a sense of unease settle over me. "But what now, Holmes? What will happen next?" Holmes turned to face me, his eyes filled with a somber resolve. "Now we face the consequences of our actions, Watson. The question is no longer whether the truth should be exposed. The question now is whether we are willing to bear the weight of exposing it." And as he spoke those words, I realized with a sinking feeling that we were nearing the point of no return. The truth, once discovered, could not be undone, and what awaited us on the other side of that revelation was uncertain, perilous, and fraught with risks that neither of us could fully comprehend. The consequences to which Holmes alluded did not announce themselves immediately. There was no sudden knock at the door, No dramatic confrontation in the street, no obvious retaliation. Instead, there came a period of uneasy quiet, the sort that follows a decisive move in a game of chess when both players pause to consider the altered board. Holmes, however, did not mistake silence for safety. On the contrary, he regarded it as confirmation that events were proceeding precisely as he had anticipated. "They are recalculating," he said on the second morning after Mr. Gray's visit. "Men who believe themselves unassailable are slow to anger, but thorough when they act." During this interval, Holmes set himself to a task I had not seen him undertake before: the deliberate construction of a record intended not for publication, but for survival. He dictated to me for hours at a time, insisting upon precision, context, and corroboration. Dates were verified, sources cross-checked, and every inference supported by documentary or testimonial evidence. It was not enough that the truth be known. It had to be undeniable. "This," Holmes explained, tapping the growing stack of papers, "is not an accusation. It is a demonstration. If released, it will speak for itself." "And you intend to release it?" I asked. Holmes hesitated. "I intend to ensure that I am not the only one who could." He divided the record into portions, each complete in itself, and arranged for copies to be placed in the care of individuals whose integrity he trusted implicitly. A retired judge, a clergyman of strong moral character, and, most unexpectedly, a former adversary who had once stood on the opposite side of the law, but now possessed both discretion and reach. "If anything happens to me," Holmes said matter-of-factly, "these documents will surface." The measure was extreme, and I told him so. Holmes accepted the observation without comment. Meanwhile, Mercer's situation grew increasingly strained. Though he had refrained from further contact with the press, his isolation weighed heavily upon him. Holmes arranged for modest financial assistance and maintained discreet oversight, but the man's nerves were plainly fraying. "They have taken everything from me once," Mercer said bitterly during a brief meeting. "Now they ask me to live quietly with what remains." Holmes met his gaze. "I ask you to live. That alone is no small thing." Yet even as he spoke, I sensed Holmes's awareness that such assurances rang hollow. Survival without vindication was a poor substitute for justice, and he knew it. The next overt move came from an unexpected quarter. Inspector Lestrade appeared at Baker Street one afternoon, his manner unusually reserved. "I'm not here officially," he said, lowering his voice once Mrs. Hudson had departed. "But I thought you ought to know. There are inquiries being made about you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "How flattering." "They're asking about your finances," Lestrade continued. "Your clients, your movements. Nothing improper, mind you, but thorough." "A fishing expedition," Holmes said. "Do they suspect me of a crime?" "Not yet," Lestrade replied, "but they're looking for leverage." Holmes thanked him and saw him out. Once alone, he allowed himself a thin smile. "They are searching for a way to discredit the messenger," he said. "A familiar tactic." "And will they find one?" I asked. Holmes's smile faded. "No man is without weakness, Watson. The question is whether mine are exploitable." That evening, Holmes received a final communication from Fairfax. It was brief, unadorned, and unmistakably ominous. "You have been given every opportunity to act sensibly. This is your last." Holmes read it, then placed it atop the others in the drawer of his desk. "They have reached the end of persuasion," he said. "Now comes coercion." "What will you do?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood by the fire, hands clasped behind him, his face half in shadow. When he spoke at last, it was with a calm that I found more unsettling than any display of agitation. "I will remove their ability to choose." The plan he outlined was audacious, even by his standards. Rather than releasing the full truth, he would force a limited disclosure, one that implicated no living official directly, yet exposed the method by which Mercer had been condemned and Carlyle silenced. The revelation would appear to originate not from Holmes, but from within the system itself, framed as a belated correction of a procedural failure. "A controlled breach," Holmes explained. "Enough to render further suppression untenable, but not enough to provoke collapse." "And Mercer?" I asked. "He will receive official exoneration," Holmes said. "Quietly, his record amended, compensation arranged. And the men responsible?" Holmes's expression hardened. "They will endure embarrassment, nothing more." "That is hardly justice," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "It is not. But it is survival. For Mercer, for Harrow, and perhaps for others, we shall never know." The mechanism for this maneuver lay in Holmes's network of contacts and his understanding of institutional self-preservation. He knew precisely which truths the system could tolerate and which it could not. By offering a version of events that acknowledged error without malice, failure without intent, he provided those in power with a means of retreat that did not require open confession. The execution of the plan required exquisite timing. Holmes leaked selected documents to a senior civil servant, known for his reformist leanings, accompanied by an analysis that framed the matter as an isolated but serious oversight. The implication was clear. Address this now, discreetly, or risk uncontrolled exposure later. For several tense days, nothing happened. Then, gradually, signs of movement appeared. A committee was convened. A review announced. No names named, no accusations leveled. But the machinery had begun to turn. Mercer received notice that his conviction was under reconsideration. Harrow was quietly transferred to a different department, his position secured. And Holmes's own scrutiny eased, as though an unseen hand had withdrawn its attention. "You have won," I said to Holmes one evening. He did not look pleased. "I have compromised," he replied. "There is a difference." News of Carlyle's death remained unchanged, his name destined to fade from public memory. That, Holmes accepted, was the price of the bargain. As the immediate danger receded, I observed in Holmes a profound weariness. The intellectual triumph that usually accompanied resolution was absent. In its place was a somber acceptance, as though he had crossed a threshold beyond which his work would never feel the same. "I found the truth," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. And in doing so, I learned that truth is not always a remedy. Sometimes it is merely another responsibility. The case was not yet finished. Consequences still loomed, and the moral reckoning Holmes had sought to delay had merely been deferred, not denied. But the direction was set, and with it, the understanding that whatever end awaited this affair, it would leave none of us unchanged. In that knowledge, the true weight of Holmes's regret first became fully apparent. The public announcement, when it finally came, was couched in the driest and most technical language imaginable. A brief notice appeared in the Gazette, referring to a procedural irregularity in an old transportation case, now under review due to newly examined archival material. There was no mention of anarchists, informants, or suppressed memoranda. Edwin Carlyle's name did not appear at all. To the casual reader, it was an administrative correction, nothing more. Holmes read the notice once, folded the paper, and set it aside. "So, it begins," he said. "For Mercer, at least," I replied. "That is something." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "For Mercer." We received confirmation within days that Jonathan Mercer's conviction had been formally quashed. The document informing him of this fact was precise and impersonal, but its effect upon the man was anything but. When Holmes and I visited him to deliver the news in person, Mercer read the letter several times before lowering it slowly, his hands trembling. "They admit it," he said hoarsely. "After all this time, they admit it was wrong." "They admit error," Holmes corrected gently. "Not intent." Mercer looked up sharply. "Does it matter?" Holmes held his gaze. "It matters to history. It matters to conscience. Whether it matters to you is something only you can decide." For a long moment, Mercer said nothing. Then he nodded once. "I will take what I am given," he said. "It is more than I ever expected." Holmes arranged for the compensation promised, enough to secure Mercer a modest independence, far from London and its associations. The man accepted it without enthusiasm, but without resentment either. Vindication, it seemed, had come too late to feel like victory. As for Mr. Harrow, his transfer proceeded quietly. He wrote once to Holmes, expressing gratitude mixed with a lingering unease. "I cannot help but feel," he wrote, "that the truth has been rearranged rather than revealed." Holmes showed me the letter but did not comment upon it. The immediate danger had passed, yet the case continued to cast its shadow over Baker Street. Holmes returned to his other work, but with a difference I could not ignore. He approached new cases with the same brilliance, the same relentless logic. Yet there was a restraint in him now, a hesitation before conclusions that once would have been delivered without a second thought. "You doubt yourself," I said to him one evening after a straightforward case of fraud had been neatly resolved. "I doubt outcomes," Holmes replied. "That is a new distinction." The Carlyle affair was not, however, finished with us. One final thread remained unresolved, the question of accountability for Carlyle's death. Officially, it remained an accident. Unofficially, Holmes had never believed it to be anything else but murder executed with professional discretion. "They will never admit it," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "Nor will they be forced to. But that does not mean the truth is entirely without consequence." He had not forgotten Samuel Trench, nor, I suspected, had the men who once protected him. Trench's position had become untenable. Cut off from his allowance, abandoned by his former handlers, he drifted into increasingly erratic behavior. Holmes kept informed through his irregulars, though he made no move to intervene. "Is it justice," I asked, "to let him suffer now?" "It is consequence," Holmes replied, "which is not the same thing, but sometimes must suffice." Trench was found dead in his lodging some weeks later, the cause attributed to drink and neglect. No inquiry followed. Holmes read the report in silence, then closed the paper with a slow, deliberate motion. "They have finished tidying," he said. The phrase struck me as chillingly apt. In the aftermath, Holmes undertook a task that surprised me more than any action he had taken during the case itself. He began to organize his files, not merely to catalogue them, but to destroy certain records entirely. Not duplicates or notes of minor importance, but complete case materials. These, he said, selecting a folder at random, contained truths that were acted upon fully. Justice was served. They may stand. He selected another and placed it upon the fire. These contained truths that were contained rather than resolved. They will not be misused. And the Carlyle affair? I asked. Holmes hesitated. He opened the leather case, removed the assembled record, and studied it for a long time. This, he said at last, will remain with me. It will not be published while I live. That is a heavy burden, I said. Yes, Holmes replied quietly, but a chosen one. He sealed the case and locked it away in a drawer I had never seen him use before. Not long after, Holmes received a brief, unsigned note. No threat this time, no warning. It contained only a single sentence. The matter is considered closed. Holmes read it and placed it with the others. They wish me to understand, he said, that the balance has been restored. And do you? I asked. Holmes looked at me with an expression I found difficult to interpret. Part weariness, part resignation, and something else besides. I understand, he said. I do not agree. From that moment on, I sensed a subtle shift in Holmes's relationship with the world he had so long observed from a position of detached superiority. He had always known that institutions could be corrupt, that men could act from base motives while cloaked in authority. What this case had shown him was something more troubling, that systems could absorb truth, neutralize it, and continue unchanged. The conflict, in its immediate form, had been resolved. Mercer was free. Harrow was safe. Further deaths had been averted. Yet the deeper conflict, the one that had taken root in Holmes himself, remained unsettled. He had found the truth. He had acted upon it. And still, something essential had been lost. One night, as we sat in silence by the fire, Holmes spoke without preamble. I have always believed, he said, that my work stood apart from consequence, that I was merely an instrument of revelation. This case has shown me that revelation itself can be a form of power. And power, I said, always carries responsibility. Holmes nodded. Yes, and responsibility, Watson, is a far heavier thing than guilt. He said no more, but I knew then that the true resolution of this affair lay not in the official records, nor in the quiet fates of the men involved, but in the enduring mark it had left upon Sherlock Holmes himself, a mark that would shape his choices long after the world had forgotten the name of Edwin Carlyle. The story was not yet at its end, but the path toward that end had narrowed, and with each step forward, Holmes walked more slowly, more carefully, as though every truth uncovered now demanded not only intellect, but judgment of the gravest kind. With the immediate pressures eased and the visible conflict apparently concluded, London settled back into its familiar rhythms. The streets around Baker Street bustled as before. Clients arrived with their petty mysteries and private troubles, and Holmes resumed his work with an outward air of normalcy. Yet I, who had observed him through many phases of triumph and despondency, could not mistake the change that had taken place. The Carlyle affair had not ended with a dramatic denouement. Instead, It had seeped into the fabric of Holmes's thinking, altering it in subtle but unmistakable ways. He was more selective now. Cases that once would have seized his interest by virtue of their intellectual challenge alone were dismissed if their resolution threatened consequences disproportionate to the crime. Where once he had delighted in exposing fraud regardless of the social standing of those involved, he now paused, rarely but perceptibly, to consider what might follow. "You are becoming cautious," I observed one afternoon, after he declined a case involving a prominent financier and a network of corrupt investments. "I am becoming precise," Holmes replied. There is a difference. Yet even as he spoke, I sensed that his distinction was as much a reassurance to himself as to me. The Carlyle affair returned to our lives not through official channels, but through memory, unbidden and persistent. Holmes found himself revisiting small details he had previously dismissed as inconsequential, a phrase used by Fairfax. The timing of Trench's payments, the precise wording of the memorandum Carlyle had uncovered. These fragments resurfaced in Holmes's thoughts, like pieces of an unfinished puzzle, refusing to settle into place. One evening, as Holmes paced the room in that familiar, restless manner, he halted abruptly. "There is something we have not accounted for," he said. I looked up from my chair. "What do you mean? The case is finished." "The administrative resolution is finished," Holmes replied. "The human one is not." He retrieved the leather case containing his private record and spread several documents upon the table. Among them was a copy of Carlyle's final memorandum, reconstructed from Holmes's memory and Harrow's testimony. "Carlyle did not merely discover the truth," Holmes said. "He understood its implications. He knew that revealing it outright would be catastrophic. That is why he hesitated." "And yet he was silenced," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "which suggests that he intended something else." Holmes traced a line of text with his finger. "Here, Carlyle wrote that the memorandum should be retained pending further clarification. That is not the language of a man preparing for exposure. It is the language of a man seeking leverage." "You think he intended to negotiate?" I asked. "I think he intended to force reform," Holmes said. "Quietly, internally. He underestimated the speed with which such intentions would be perceived as threats." The realization seemed to trouble Holmes deeply. Carlyle, in attempting to act responsibly within the system, had placed himself in the most vulnerable position of all. Visible enough to alarm, restrained enough to be expendable. That, Holmes said softly, was his fatal error. The insight did not alter the outcome, yet it sharpened Holmes's sense of responsibility. Carlyle had been neither reckless nor heroic. He had been conscientious. His death, therefore, was not merely collateral damage, but a calculated correction. From that moment, Holmes became increasingly preoccupied with the notion of unseen casualties, those who suffer not because they defy power openly, but because they attempt to work within its bounds. It was a theme that surfaced repeatedly in his later cases, though never so starkly as here. The next reminder of the affair came in the form of an unexpected letter delivered without ceremony. It bore Harrow's handwriting. "Mr. Holmes, I write to inform you that I have resigned my post, officially for reasons of health, unofficially because I can no longer reconcile my conscience with my duties. I wished you to know that your intervention spared me worse choices, but did not absolve me of responsibility. I intend to leave England." Holmes read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "He is wiser than he knows," Holmes said. "Distance may yet grant him peace." "And you?" I asked. "Will distance grant you the same?" Holmes did not answer directly. "I have chosen a different exile," he said, "one of silence." In the weeks that followed, Holmes declined all invitations that might draw attention to his role in the Carlyle affair. He refused interviews, avoided public appearances, and discouraged Watson, myself, from alluding to the matter even obliquely in my published accounts. "This case," he said, "will not be a story." "It is one already," I replied. "If not to the public, then to us." Holmes acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. "Then it shall remain ours." Yet silence, I learned, is rarely absolute. Holmes's reputation ensured that whispers continued to circulate, particularly among those who understood how power truly operated. I became aware, through indirect remarks and subtle shifts in behavior, that Holmes was now regarded with a measure of caution by certain circles. He was still respected, still consulted, but no longer entirely trusted. "They see you as unpredictable," I said once. Holmes smiled faintly. "That may be my greatest asset." Despite this outward composure, there were moments when Holmes's control faltered. Late at night, when the city lay quiet and the lamplight cast long shadows across the room, I would sometimes find him staring into the fire, his expression distant. "You regret it," I said on one such occasion. "Yes," Holmes replied without hesitation. "Which part?" He considered. "Not the discovery. Never that. I regret the necessity of choice." "In what way?" "I have always believed," Holmes said, "that the truth once known dictated action. This case taught me that truth merely presents options, and that choosing among them is an act of judgment, not deduction." "And that troubles you?" "It terrifies me," Holmes said quietly, "because judgment is fallible." The conflict that had driven the Carlyle affair between exposure and containment had resolved itself externally, but internally it continued to evolve. Holmes had prevented further bloodshed, secured a measure of justice, and avoided national upheaval. Yet he had also accepted limits to his role that sat uneasily with his nature. As spring turned towards summer, the immediate echoes of the case began to fade from public consciousness. Names were forgotten, files were closed, life moved on. Only Holmes seemed unable or unwilling to do so entirely. One evening, as we prepared to retire, Holmes paused at the door of the sitting room. "Watson," he said, "if ever you are tempted to record this affair, I ask you not to." I looked at him in surprise. "Not even anonymously?" "No," Holmes said, "especially not anonymously. This is not a lesson the world is ready to learn." "And when will it be?" Holmes shook his head. "Perhaps never." He extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The truth had been found. The danger had been contained. Justice, in its imperfect human form, had been approximated. Yet the cost of these achievements lingered, unspoken and unresolved, shaping the future course of a man who had once believed himself immune to such burdens. The end was approaching, not of the story, but of the certainty with which Holmes had once viewed his place within it. The summer advanced with deceptive gentleness, as though London itself sought to mask the undercurrents of strain that still flowed beneath its orderly surface. Holmes continued his work, but I observed that his methods had undergone a quiet evolution. Where once he had pursued conclusions with uncompromising directness, he now displayed a measured restraint, pausing not to doubt his deductions, but to consider the aftermath they would inevitably produce. This change did not go unnoticed by those who knew him well. Lestrade remarked upon it obliquely during the visit, commenting that Holmes seemed less inclined to kick over hornets' nests. Holmes accepted the observation without protest. "I have learned," he said later to me, "that hornets seldom build nests without reason. One must ask what else they are guarding." It was during this period that Holmes received a case which, in lesser hands, might have been dismissed as trivial. A junior clerk from the Treasury, one Thomas Bellows, had been accused of altering figures in a minor report. The sums involved were negligible, the evidence circumstantial. Yet Holmes accepted the case at once, to my surprise. "This," he said, "is precisely the sort of matter that reveals the present climate." Bellows was a nervous young man, earnest and painfully aware of his insignificance within the machinery that now threatened to crush him. Holmes listened to his account with uncommon patience, asking few questions at first, allowing the man's anxiety to exhaust itself. "They say I altered the totals," Bellows said, his voice quavering. "But I only copied what was given to me. I swear it." Holmes examined the documents carefully, then smiled faintly. "You did exactly what was expected of you," he said, "which is why you have been selected." "Selected?" Bellows echoed. "Yes," Holmes replied, "for demonstration." Holmes explained to me later that Bellows' case bore an unsettling resemblance to Mercer's, different in scale, but identical in principle. An error had been made upstream. Rather than acknowledge it, responsibility was being displaced onto a convenient subordinate. "They are practicing," Holmes said, quietly, testing the ease with which blame can be reassigned. "And you intend to stop them?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was thoughtful. "I intend to remind them that convenience is not always invisible." He did so, not by public accusation, but by assembling a meticulous reconstruction of the report's handling, demonstrating, without overt condemnation, that Bellows could not have altered the figures without detection. The matter was dropped quietly. Bellows was released, shaken but unharmed. "It is a small victory," I said. Holmes nodded. "But a necessary one. Systems persist by habit. Habits can be interrupted." Yet even as Holmes engaged in these smaller contests, I sensed that the Carlyle affair remained the axis around which his thoughts continued to turn. It was not regret alone that troubled him, but the recognition that he had glimpsed a mechanism far larger than any single case. A mechanism capable of absorbing truth, neutralizing it, and continuing on with minimal adjustment. That recognition came into sharper focus when Holmes received a visit from an old acquaintance, Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft's arrival was unannounced, but unmistakable. His presence filled the room with an air of authority that differed markedly from Sherlock's, less kinetic, more immovable. The brothers greeted one another with mutual reserve. "I trust you are well," Mycroft said. "Well enough," Sherlock replied. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" Mycroft seated himself heavily. "I wished to see you," he said, "because there has been discussion." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Regarding you?" Mycroft replied. And your recent activities. I see, Holmes said. And what is the prevailing opinion? Mycroft folded his hands. That you came perilously close to causing damage, that you refrained ultimately, and that this restraint is to your credit. Holmes snorted softly. High praise. Mycroft continued. You must understand, Sherlock, that the machinery you encountered is not malicious by design. It is conservative. It preserves what exists. At any cost, Holmes said. At calculated cost, Mycroft corrected. There is a difference. Holmes regarded his brother intently. Tell me, Mycroft, do you believe Carlyle's death was calculated? Mycroft hesitated, just perceptibly. I believe it was anticipated. Holmes's expression hardened. Then we differ. You always have, Mycroft replied. But I did not come to argue. I came to advise. Advise me to do what? To continue as you are now, Mycroft said. Engaged but circumspect. Useful but not disruptive. Holmes laughed quietly. You ask me to become an accessory. No, Mycroft said. I ask you to become realistic. Holmes rose and turned away. Realism, he said, is often merely a justification for surrender. Mycroft stood as well. Be careful, Sherlock. You are not immune to consequence, nor are those around you. The implication was clear. Mycroft departed shortly thereafter, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken warning. You believe him, I said once we were alone. I believe he speaks sincerely, Holmes replied. That is what makes it dangerous. The encounter unsettled Holmes more than he cared to admit. For all his independence, Mycroft's words carried weight, not least because they confirmed what Holmes already knew, that his actions were being watched, evaluated, and quietly constrained. That evening, Holmes returned to the leather case once more. He removed the documents, reviewed them briefly, then added a final memorandum of his own, dated, signed, and sealed. What is that? I asked. A boundary, Holmes replied. A record of what I will not do again. He replaced the papers and locked the case. As the days shortened imperceptibly and summer began its slow decline, I observed in Holmes a settling of resolve. He had not retreated, nor had he capitulated. Instead, he had adapted, an adjustment born not of fear, but of hard-earned understanding. The conflict that had defined the Carlyle affair had not ended with Mercer's exoneration or the quiet closure of files. It had shifted inward, becoming a continual negotiation between knowledge and restraint, between capability and conscience. Holmes had found the truth. He had acted upon it in part. And now, having glimpsed the full reach of consequence, he walked forward with eyes open, no longer comforted by the illusion that deduction alone could absolve him of judgment. The story moved inexorably toward its end, not with the crash of revelation, but with the steady accumulation of choices made and paths foreclosed. And in that accumulation lay the final reckoning yet to come. Autumn arrived with a suddenness that felt almost deliberate, as though the season itself sought to impose definition after the ambiguities of summer. The mornings grew sharper, the evenings longer, and Baker Street once more filled with the smell of coal smoke and damp wool. Holmes appeared invigorated by the change, though the energy he displayed was of a different quality than before, more disciplined, less impulsive, as if each motion were governed by an internal calculus invisible to anyone but himself. It was during this period that the final tremors of the Carlyle affair began to make themselves felt, not through direct confrontation, But through subtle distortions in the professional landscape, Holmes had long navigated with ease. Clients arrived who seemed less interested in resolution than in reassurance. Others came bearing cases whose apparent simplicity dissolved under scrutiny, revealing motives that extended beyond personal gain into the realm of institutional convenience. One such case involved a shipping magnate accused of bribery by a dismissed clerk. The evidence appeared straightforward: ledgers altered, payments concealed, a familiar pattern. Yet Holmes, after a brief examination, declined to pursue it. "This is not a matter of guilt," he said. "It is a matter of permission." "Permission?" I asked. "The clerk has accused a man whose interests intersect with others," Holmes replied. "If I expose him, the consequences will be selectively borne. The truth will not prevail. It will be redistributed." "You could still act," I said. "You have never hesitated before." Holmes met my gaze. "I hesitate now because I know precisely how such truths are absorbed. They do not topple structures. They are diverted, repurposed, and forgotten." The case was referred elsewhere. Whether justice was ultimately served, I cannot say. Holmes did not inquire further. This growing pattern culminated in an event that neither of us had anticipated. Holmes received a formal invitation, this time unmistakably official, to attend a private gathering at a townhouse near St. James's Square. The invitation bore no explicit agenda, but the list of attendees, which Holmes deduced with little effort, included several men whose influence extended far beyond their public roles. "They wish to see me," Holmes said, "not as an adversary, as a quantity to be assessed." "And will you go?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes replied. "It would be unwise not to." The evening of the gathering was marked by studied elegance. The townhouse was appointed with restrained opulence, the guests carefully chosen to represent a spectrum of authority: political, financial, and administrative. Holmes moved among them with his usual composure, observing more than he spoke. I accompanied him, though my presence was largely ornamental. Conversation skirted the edges of substance, touching upon reforms, public confidence, and the necessity of discretion in turbulent times. No one mentioned Carlyle. No one mentioned Mercer. And yet, the shadow of that affair lay over the proceedings like an unspoken understanding. At one point, Holmes found himself engaged by a senior official whose manner combined geniality with precision. "You have a reputation, Mr. Holmes," the man said lightly, "for seeing what others overlook." Holmes inclined his head. "It is a matter of attention." "And judgment," the official added. "Attention alone is insufficient." "On that," Holmes replied, "we are agreed." The exchange was brief, but its implication lingered. Holmes was being acknowledged, not merely tolerated, but integrated on terms that required mutual restraint. When we departed, Holmes was silent for some time. At last, as we walked through the lamplit streets, he spoke. "They are attempting to normalize me," he said. "In what sense?" I asked. "To define the limits within which I may operate," Holmes replied, "to render me predictable." "And does that concern you?" "Yes," Holmes said, "because predictability is a form of control." Yet even as he spoke, I sensed that Holmes recognized the necessity of this engagement. To remain entirely outside the system was to invite suppression. To enter it fully was to risk co-option. The path he now walked lay uneasily between. That tension came to a head several weeks later when Holmes was approached, quietly, privately, with an offer of formal association. Not employment precisely, but consultation on matters deemed too sensitive for ordinary channels. "They are offering you a role," I said, astonished. "Influence." "They are offering me responsibility," Holmes corrected, "without authority." "And will you accept?" Holmes considered. "If I refuse, they will proceed without me. If I accept, I may yet prevent certain outcomes." "That is a dangerous rationale," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but it is also a familiar one." He accepted conditionally. The arrangement was informal, deniable, and strictly bounded. Holmes would advise. Decisions would remain elsewhere. The first matter brought to him under this new understanding was telling in its restraint. A question of whether to reopen an inquiry into a long-resolved labor dispute that had resulted in several unexplained deaths. Holmes reviewed the materials and recommended against reopening, not because the deaths were insignificant, but because the evidence now available would implicate parties no longer living, while provoking unrest among those still bearing the consequences. "It would be revelation without remedy," Holmes said, "a cruelty masquerading as justice." The recommendation was accepted. "You are becoming what you once opposed," I said that evening, unable to restrain myself. Holmes did not take offense. "I am becoming what the situation requires," he replied. "That is not the same thing." Yet the distinction weighed upon him. I saw it in the way he lingered over old cases, rereading his own conclusions as though searching for some lost certainty. I saw it in his music, which had grown more somber, less playful, as though even his violin now acknowledged the burden he carried. The Carlyle affair had taught him that truth alone was insufficient, that without power it could be smothered, and with power it could become destructive. Navigating between those realities required compromises he had never imagined making. And still, the matter was not entirely at rest. One final development, subtle but significant, came to Holmes's attention through an indirect channel. A junior official involved in the original suppression had died suddenly, leaving behind a personal journal. The contents were rumored to include references to the clerk and the river. Holmes was informed discreetly that the journal had been secured and would not be released. He nodded when told. "That is for the best," he said. Yet later, alone with me, his composure faltered. "There are truths," he said, "that decay if left buried. They do not vanish, they ferment." "And what happens then?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was distant. "Then they return in forms we cannot control." The story had not yet reached its end. The mechanisms Holmes had engaged were still in motion, their long-term consequences unknowable. What had begun as a single disappearance had expanded into a confrontation with the nature of authority itself, and with Holmes's own place within it. He had found the truth. He had acted upon it partially. And now, bound by knowledge and constrained by choice, he moved forward into a world that required not only deduction, but compromise of the most perilous kind. The final reckoning drew nearer, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of decisions whose weight could no longer be ignored. By the time winter began its gradual encroachment upon London, the shape of Holmes's new position had become clearer, not through any formal declaration, but through the quiet accumulation of expectations placed upon him. He was consulted more frequently now, always discreetly, always under the pretense of seeking his unique analytical insight rather than his moral judgment. And yet, it was precisely that judgment which was being tested again and again in matters whose resolutions would never appear in any public record. Holmes did not deceive himself about this. He understood that his value lay not merely in his capacity to uncover truth, but in his willingness, conditional though it was, to weigh its consequences before allowing it to surface. This understanding troubled him more deeply than any open opposition ever had. "They have not tamed me," he said to me one evening, after returning from a consultation whose details he declined to share. "But they are learning how to anticipate me." "And is that not dangerous?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because anticipation reduces surprise, and surprise is often the only weapon truth possesses." Despite this unease, Holmes continued, driven by a conviction that partial engagement was preferable to irrelevance. He intervened where he believed intervention might limit harm, declined where he sensed his involvement would merely lend legitimacy to injustice, and walked a narrow path between cooperation and resistance that few could even perceive, let alone judge. Yet the Carlisle affair, though officially buried, refused to remain inert. Its residue surfaced unexpectedly in the form of a document. An unsigned memorandum circulated quietly amongst certain offices, proposing new guidelines for the handling of sensitive archival material. The language was cautious, but the intent unmistakable. Access would be further restricted, oversight concentrated, accountability diffused. Holmes read the memorandum with growing irritation. "They are institutionalizing the lesson," he said. "Not the one they should have learned, but the one most useful to them." "And what lesson is that?" I asked. "That exposure is dangerous," Holmes replied. "Not wrongdoing." He considered intervening, drafting a counter-proposal that would preserve oversight without inviting paralysis. In the end, he refrained. "They would accept it," he said, "and then ignore it. Or worse, use it as proof of reform while altering nothing." This decision marked a subtle but significant shift. Holmes was no longer merely weighing the consequences of action. He was now weighing the consequences of appearing to act. It was during this same period that Holmes learned, through Mycroft, of an inquiry being quietly abandoned. The subject was a network of informants whose activities had resulted in several questionable convictions over the years. The evidence was incomplete, the political risk considerable. "They decided it was not worth pursuing," Mycroft said, not without a hint of defensiveness. Holmes regarded him coolly. "Then they decided it was worth preserving." Mycroft sighed. "You cannot correct every injustice, Sherlock." "No," Holmes agreed, "but one might refrain from manufacturing new ones." The exchange ended without resolution, leaving behind a tension that neither brother could entirely dispel. Mycroft represented the logic of the system, its caution, its inertia, its belief that stability outweighed truth. Holmes, increasingly aware of that logic's power, struggled to define his own opposition to it in terms that were neither naive nor complicit. The strain manifested itself in Holmes's health. He grew thinner, more restless. His sleep was irregular, his violin playing increasingly introspective. Where once his music had been an outlet for surplus energy, it now seemed a means of containing something darker. "You are carrying too much," I told him one night after finding him awake at an hour when even his most intense cases had previously exhausted him. Yes, Holmes replied, but it is not weight alone that troubles me. It is imbalance. In what sense? I have always believed, Holmes said slowly, that my detachment protected me, that by standing apart I could observe clearly and act decisively. This case has drawn me inward into the very mechanisms I once examined from a distance. And that frightens you. It should, Holmes said. It should frighten anyone. The true danger, I realized, lay not in Holmes's proximity to power, but in his growing familiarity with it. He understood now how decisions were justified, how narratives were shaped, how responsibility dissolved as it ascended through layers of authority. This understanding granted him influence, but at the cost of innocence he had never known he possessed. The final tremor of the Carlyle affair arrived, fittingly without drama. Holmes was informed, again discreetly, that all remaining materials related to the original bombing case had been reclassified and permanently sealed. No further review would be permitted. "They are closing the book," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and ensuring no one reads the margins." He made no protest, no appeal, no attempt to circumvent the decision. Instead, he retrieved his own sealed case and removed the final memorandum he had written months earlier. He reread it carefully, then added a single line at the bottom. "Some truths demand silence, not because they are false, but because they are lethal." He signed it, dated it, and returned the document to its place. "What will you do with that?" I asked. "Nothing," Holmes said. "That is the point." The realization struck me then with unexpected force. Holmes's greatest act in this affair was not what he had revealed, nor even what he had concealed, but what he had chosen never to use. Knowledge, once acquired, had always been his instrument. Now it had become his restraint. Yet restraint, I knew, was not the same as peace. As the year drew toward its end, Holmes's consultations became fewer, his selectivity more pronounced. He remained engaged, alert, formidable. But there was a reserve in him now, a sense that each case was measured not only against reason, but against memory. The memory of Edwin Carlyle, methodical, cautious, dead. The memory of Mercer, vindicated but diminished. The memory of a truth uncovered too late to save the man who found it first. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside Baker Street, Holmes spoke with an uncharacteristic frankness. "I have always believed," he said, "that ignorance was the enemy. I now understand that certainty can be just as dangerous." "And what will you do with that understanding?" I asked. Holmes looked into the fire, watching the flames consume a small fragment of paper he had fed them absent-mindedly. "I will remember it," he said, "and hope that memory restrains me when intellect alone would not." The story was nearing its conclusion. The machinery Holmes had engaged continued to turn, its outcomes dispersed across offices and lives far removed from Baker Street. The conflict that had begun with the disappearance had evolved into something far larger and far more personal. Holmes had found the truth. He had learned its cost. And now, standing at the threshold of the end, he carried not triumph, but a burden that no deduction could lighten. The final resolution approached, not as an answer, but as an acceptance. The year turned with little ceremony. London greeted the new calendar much as it always had, with cold streets, crowded omnibuses, and an air of determined continuity. To the city at large, Nothing of consequence had changed. Institutions remained intact. Names had been shuffled, files sealed, procedures amended in ways invisible to those not trained to look for them. The Carlisle affair, once so perilously alive, had faded into administrative oblivion. Yet within the confines of Baker Street, its presence endured. Holmes did not speak of it unless prompted, and even then only obliquely. Still, I perceived its influence in the smallest habits. He reread correspondence more carefully. He verified sources he would once have trusted implicitly. He asked, more often than before, not whether a thing was true, but why it had been allowed to appear true for so long. This vigilance did not make him less effective. If anything, it sharpened him. But it lent his work a gravity that had not been there before, a sense that every conclusion carried weight beyond the immediate problem it resolved. One evening, as we sat together reviewing the notes of a minor burglary case, Holmes paused mid-sentence. "Do you know," he said thoughtfully, "what most disturbed me about Carlyle?" "That he was murdered," I replied. "Yes," Holmes said, "but more than that he behaved exactly as he was supposed to." I looked at him in surprise. "How do you mean?" "He was diligent," Holmes continued, "cautious, loyal to the institution he served. He neither rushed to exposure nor retreated into silence. He attempted to reconcile truth with responsibility, and for that he was eliminated." He closed the file before us, his interest in it evidently gone. "The lesson is clear. Systems do not forgive conscientious disruption, only incompetence or rebellion." "And where does that leave you?" I asked. Holmes considered. "In a narrow corridor," he said, "where movement must be measured." That corridor narrowed still further when Holmes received what could only be described as a final confirmation of his altered status. A letter arrived, bearing no official seal, but written in a hand whose authority required none. It expressed appreciation for Holmes's discretion in recent matters, acknowledged his continued usefulness, and concluded with an assurance that his independence would be respected so long as it remained constructive. "They are defining the terms," Holmes said after reading it. "And if you refuse them?" I asked. "They will not acknowledge refusal," Holmes replied. "They will merely withdraw cooperation and allow circumstances to correct the anomaly." "You?" I said. "Yes," Holmes agreed. The letter did not threaten. It did not need to. Its power lay in its certainty. Holmes folded it carefully and placed it with the others, his expression unreadable. "I will continue," he said at last, "but on my terms." "And those are?" "That I will choose my silences," Holmes replied, "not accept theirs." This declaration, understated as it was, marked the closest thing to defiance I had heard from him since the affair began. Yet it was not defiance in the old sense. No dramatic challenge, no public stand. It was a private boundary, drawn quietly and maintained at personal cost. That cost became evident when Holmes declined a case that, by all rights, should have intrigued him immensely. It involved the disappearance of a political organizer whose activities had begun to attract attention. The circumstances bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Carlyle's case. Official indifference, sealed rooms, carefully managed explanations. Holmes read the initial summary, then returned it without comment. "You see the pattern," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and I see the end of it. Could you not intervene? Prevent another?" Holmes raised a hand. Do not ask me to promise what I cannot deliver. He explained with a candor that startled me that intervention in such a case would require a degree of confrontation he was no longer certain would serve anyone's interests. The mechanisms at work were too well rehearsed, the outcomes too easily controlled. To expose this, Holmes said, would be to repeat Carlyle's mistake, only this time knowingly. And so you will do nothing? I will do what I can, Holmes said, which may appear to be nothing. The answer troubled me deeply. It troubled Holmes as well, though he would not admit it. That night, I found him seated at his desk long after midnight, his papers spread out before him, his expression one of intense concentration. You are reconsidering, I said. I am remembering, Holmes replied. There is a difference. He retrieved the leather case one final time and removed the compiled record of the Carlyle affair. He did not read it. Instead, he weighed it in his hands, as though assessing not its contents, but its significance. This, he said quietly, is the most dangerous thing I possess. Because of what it contains? I asked. No, Holmes replied. Because of what it teaches. He replaced the case and locked it away. In the days that followed, Holmes took a step I had not anticipated. He began, discreetly, to pass along fragments of his understanding, not the specifics of the Carlyle affair, but the principles it had revealed. He advised younger men in positions of influence to document carefully, to protect themselves, to recognize the difference between error and expedience. He spoke in hypotheticals, in abstractions, never naming names. They must learn, he said, without being burdened by the whole truth at once. You are shaping successors, I said. I am attempting to prevent repetition, Holmes replied. Whether such efforts would bear fruit, neither of us could know. Systems resist change, especially when that change threatens their foundational assumptions. Still, Holmes persisted, believing that knowledge, even constrained, might yet alter the future in ways no single act of exposure ever could. As winter deepened, the pace of Holmes's work slowed. He remained sharp, engaged, formidable, but selective to the point of severity. Each case was weighed not merely for solvability, but for consequence. Each truth uncovered was examined for its potential to heal or harm. The conflict that had defined the Carlyle affair, the tension between truth and responsibility, had not resolved itself into a simple answer. Instead, it had become a permanent condition, one Holmes carried with him into every subsequent deduction. One evening, as we sat together in reflective silence, Holmes spoke with an unusual softness. I once believed, he said, that regret was the price of error. I now know it is often the price of understanding. And do you regret this? I asked. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. I regret that the truth required such payment, he said. Not that I found it. The end was close now. Not the end of Holmes's career, nor of his engagement with the world's injustices, but the end of this particular reckoning. One final act remained, one final acceptance yet to be articulated. The truth had been found. The choice had been made. What remained was the living with it. And that, I sensed, would prove the hardest task of all. The final resolution of the Carlyle affair did not arrive with revelation or confession, but with a moment of deliberate choice. Quiet, irrevocable, and witnessed by no one save myself. It occurred on a grey February morning when London lay muffled beneath a low sky and the world seemed reduced to shades of stone and smoke. Holmes had been awake since before dawn. I found him seated at the table, the leather case open before him for what I knew would be the last time. The documents lay arranged with meticulous order: Carlyle's reconstructed memorandum, Holmes's own analysis, corroborating testimonies, timelines, and that final line he had added months earlier. Together, they formed a complete and devastating truth, one capable of unraveling careers, discrediting institutions, and igniting public fury. It was, beyond question, the truth. "You intend to destroy it," I said quietly. Holmes did not look up. "I intend to conclude it." "There is a difference." "Yes," he replied. "Destruction implies fear. This is judgment." He began removing the papers one by one, feeding them slowly into the fire. He did not hurry. He did not avert his eyes. Each page burned thoroughly before the next followed, the flames reducing months of labor and years of concealed injustice to curling ash. "This is not surrender," he said, as if answering my unspoken accusation. "Nor is it mercy. It is containment, chosen freely rather than imposed." "You are certain?" I asked. Holmes paused, holding the final document, the one bearing his own hand. "No," he said simply, "but certainty is a luxury I can no longer afford." He placed the last page into the fire and closed the grate. The leather case, now empty, he returned to its drawer. It would remain there, a vessel stripped of purpose. In that moment, the case truly ended. There would be no further inquiries, no belated exposé, no reckoning in the public square. Edwin Carlyle would remain officially a man who had died by misadventure. The officials responsible would continue their work, unpunished and unnamed. The system would endure, and yet not unchanged. Jonathan Mercer lived out his days in quiet anonymity, free, compensated, and no longer hunted. Mr. Harrow left England and built a life elsewhere, his conscience bruised but intact. The machinery that had enabled the injustice had been forced, however subtly, to adjust, to account, to hesitate, to anticipate scrutiny where once there had been none. Holmes had not dismantled it, but he had wounded it. Later that day, we walked together through the streets, the cold air sharp and clarifying. Holmes seemed lighter than he had in months, not relieved, but resolved. "You regret it," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but not in the way you think." "Explain." "I regret that Carlyle died believing he had failed," Holmes said. "He did not. He forced the truth into existence. That it could not survive openly is not his fault." "And you?" I asked. "Do you believe you failed?" Holmes stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "No," he said. "For the first time, I believe I acted as a man, not merely as an intellect." That distinction, so simply stated, carried the full weight of the journey we had undertaken. Holmes had always trusted his mind to guide him unerringly toward justice. This case had taught him that justice was not a destination reached by deduction alone, but a balance struck amid competing harms. In the weeks that followed, Holmes returned fully to his practice. Clients came, mysteries were solved, criminals were exposed. Yet those who knew him well could sense a difference. He was no less brilliant, no less relentless, but he was more deliberate, more human. He no longer spoke of truth as an absolute imperative. Instead, he spoke of responsibility. One evening, as we sat together by the fire, I asked him the question that had lingered unspoken since the beginning. If you had known the cost at the outset, Carlyle's death, the compromises, the regret, would you have taken the case? Holmes considered for a long time. Yes, he said at last, because ignorance would not have spared them. It would only have spared me. And that, I said, would have been easier. Holmes shook his head. Easier is not the same as right. He picked up his violin then and began to play. Not one of his lighter airs, but a slow, reflective piece that seemed to hold within it both loss and acceptance. As the music filled the room, I understood that this was his true resolution. Not victory, not absolution, but understanding born with eyes open. Sherlock Holmes had found the truth, and he had regretted it. Not because it was false, nor because it was dangerous, but because it revealed that even the keenest mind must sometimes choose between harms, and that such choices leave scars no brilliance can erase. This is why I record the case now, though its particulars are lost to the fire and its names withheld. Not as a warning, nor as a condemnation, but as a testament to the moment when the world's greatest detective learned that truth, once found, does not always set us free. Sometimes it merely asks us to decide what kind of men we are willing to be.